Tom Simmons here with another installment of Economics with Tully, and this is the second of 3 videos that I will be making on the subject of international trade. And we are here on board La Goélette Grosse Île, the schooner Grosse Île, on the St. Lawrence River in Montreal for this video. I'm assuming you saw the first video, which was a general overview of the principles of free trade and why economists so often are in favor of permitting the free movement of goods, labor, products, service, and capital across borders. But I ended that video by suggesting that there are many people, especially in the political environment, who are not as thrilled about free trade as economists are. And so this particular video is going to be devoted to an examination of those issues. And those who wish to prevent free trade or protect home industries, that comes under the topic of protectionism. That's what we call it, protectionism. Because these people generally want to protect home industries or the home country from what they see as the negative effects of free trade. So let's get right down to the number one objection that's always that is always levied against free trade, and that is the loss of jobs. If you remember from my first video, we talked about how most nations in a free trade scenario will gravitate towards doing those jobs, producing those products that they produce most efficiently, and then trading with other nations who produce goods they need more efficiently than they do. And you end up with more goods and services at cheaper prices for everybody, which benefits all consumers and raises standards of living. So what we have here is a situation that certain jobs are going to be lost in a free trade situation. Best example I can give you is the steel industry in the United States. When Canada, the United States, and Mexico entered into the North American Free Trade Agreement, that permitted the free movement of goods and services across borders. And one of the industries that got hit very hard was the steel industry. Entire plants in Bethlehem and Allentown, Pennsylvania, and Cleveland, Ohio, completely shut down, and thousands of steel workers were out of jobs. And many point to that loss of jobs as evidence that free trade is not good, because it simply means that it's a race to the bottom, that we end up getting goods and services as cheaply as possible, and that this hurts American income. And as an economist, I need to be very specific about the effect on jobs when you enter a free trade arrangement. It is absolutely true that jobs in specific industries are going to be hurt. And the steel industry is the prime example, the American steel industry. And when these jobs are located in specific communities and there's thousands of jobs connected to them, and that's what's lost, the impact is felt very, very harshly in specific locations. And it's very easy to point to those towns and say, look what free trade did. It destroyed our jobs. And so the assumption that most Americans make is that that's the end result. We have free trade, we get cheaper goods in from abroad, and it means we lose American jobs. But that's really not the case across the broader economy. A very simple example. If steel remained in the United States, we could end up paying, let's say, $100 for an American tricycle. And if I have $100 in my pocket, I spend $100, I buy that tricycle, I have nothing left in my pocket except for that tricycle. However, if I'm able to buy that same tricycle made from Mexican steel for only $50, that means I can buy that tricycle for $50. And it means I still have $50 to be able to spend in the broader spectrum of the economy. restaurants with artisans or craftsmen, on flowers at the florist, or any other number of things that I might be able to spend my money on. What this does for me as a consumer is it means I now have more spending power, and I can spend my disposable income among many, many different jobs. Classic example is that when we lost all those steel jobs, and we lost them by the thousands, and that was in the late 90s under President Clinton, we also had the lowest unemployment rate in the nation's history, 2.9%, even after we lost the steel jobs. And that's because steel goes into making many, many different products and goods. The construction industry uses steel to erect buildings. The auto industry uses steel to make cars. The railroad industry uses steel to lay track. Steel is used in a lot of different products. And by being able to use imported steel, it actually was much, much less expensive for all consumers across the board. That left them with more disposable income, and that gave them the opportunity to purchase goods and services from a broad range of the economy. And the problem is that we can point to the steel industry jobs that were lost. But what we can't do is say, but that money was spent in this industry, because it was spent across the board in many industries. So yes, jobs are lost, but they're lost in very specific places. Another example on this very, very issue, on my drive up to Montreal this week, I blew my car engine. And we had to put a new engine in the car, and that engine cost me $2,800. And that was imported steel. Now, if I had had to purchase an American-made engine, it probably would have cost me twice as much. If it had cost me twice as much to put the engine in the car, I would not have been able to continue my trip to Montreal because I wouldn't have had the money to do so. Because I had the disposable income to do that, I was able to then take 2 trips on this boat, the Crocil, which is the oldest schooner and the last schooner on the St. Lawrence River. It's a labor of love. It's an old wooden boat that they're trying to restore. And I was spending my money here, as well as in restaurants and in at souvenir stores and at taverns and at a sports stadium and in many, many different places throughout the city. It's because I had that extra disposable income. So, yes, jobs are lost in that industry, but it gives consumers the opportunity to spend their disposable income in a wider range of activities and goods and services. The consumer is always in charge here. In fact, it was actually estimated, the wind is kicking up here, it was actually estimated that when Bush put tariffs on the steel industry, which is a tax, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, yes, we saved some steel jobs, but it actually cost Americans $750,000 per steel job saved. It would have been cheaper to simply have given each steel worker $100,000 than to actually try and put a protectionist measure into place. So, that's the first issue, and that's the jobs issue. The second issue is one of national security. Even though another country may produce a good more inexpensively or more efficiently, we may not want to depend on another nation for our electric goods or maybe our oil. There's considered to be an issue of national security at stake when we are relying on another nation for a particular good, which, if ever cut off, could put us in a difficult situation. And related to that, of course, is the issue of quality control. Not every good that comes in from another nation is of a high quality. We saw this a few years ago when we imported sheetrock from China. Many, many houses use sheetrock because it was less expensive than American-made sheetrock. And the problem with it is that a chemical was used that off-gassed, meaning that after it was installed, there was this airborne chemical that was being released. It was so bad that it couldn't be corrected, and every single house built with this sheetrock had to be gutted right down to the framing after the house was built and new sheetrock put in. We also have not permitted beef from Argentina to come in because Argentina has not eliminated hoof and mouth disease, and the United States has. So rather than risk the possibility of introducing an animal disease into the country that we've eradicated, we simply don't permit Argentine beef to come into the country. So sometimes issues of national security or quality control will also be an instigator to enact a protectionist measure and not allow free trade to simply happen. A third reason that some people support protectionist measures is simply due to using these measures as political rewards and punishment. For 50 years, the United States tried to punish Cuba by not permitting the importation of Cuban goods. When we invaded Iraq and went into Afghanistan, we needed to use air facilities and bases in Pakistan and Jordan. And so we used free trade with those two countries as a carrot. We basically said we will permit free trade of your goods if you will let us use your bases. So very often we look at protectionism not as a way of improving an economy, but as a way of punishing nations we don't like, such as, again, not only Cuba, but we've also had embargoes on Iran and in the past Iraq, and also to reward friends in a way of dealing on the international political scene. That's not something an economist is all that thrilled about, because we look at trade as the mechanism that makes an economy grow. And another reason, a fourth reason that many people are not in favor of 100% free trade is due to the social standards in other countries. There is a fear that other countries don't have protections for labor that we do, or they don't have environmental protections that we do. So that if a company was in the United States, they might not be able to dump toxic chemicals into a river, but if they moved to Mexico, let's say, where the standards are more lax, they could simply pollute and harm the environment. So you've got all these reasons, even though free trade from an economic perspective creates more goods and services at lower prices for all consumers and raises standards of living overall, there are these concerns that people have, and that's the loss of jobs in specific industries, although the overall effect will be to create more jobs in other industries, national security, quality control, the use of these techniques as political rewards and punishments, and also the effect on societies outside of our own. So because of these reasons, there are basically three measures that are used to restrict free trade. The first is the embargo, and the embargo simply means it will not come in. The examples I used with Cuba was an embargo. We didn't allow Cuban goods into the country. And the example I used with Argentine beef is an embargo. We're not permitting that product to come into the United States. Now, of course, the problem with that, as all economists know, is that when you say you can't buy or sell something, that does not mean it's not going to be bought or sold. If there is a demand for a good or a service, and there is someone willing to supply it, it's going to trade hands. It just means it trades hands on the black market. Instead of being transparent and open where everyone can see it, it goes underground, it goes into the underground economy. It means the quality control is poor. You don't quite know what you're getting, and you very often might get especially a food product or something that's tainted, and you have no recourse because it shouldn't have come into the country in the first place. But embargoes are a tool that we use, just knowing full well it's not going to stop that good from coming into the country. Lord knows, marijuana comes into the country, anabolic steroids come into the country, Cuban cigars come into the country. Almost everything that we have said no to comes into the country, It just comes in on the black market and is traded out of sight, where it's not regulated. The second tool that protectionists will use is the tariff. And a tariff is a tax on an imported good. So what that does is it puts the price of that good somewhere in between a free trade situation and an embargo situation. So for instance, let's say that Brazilian oranges were coming into the United States, and they were coming in very inexpensively, and Americans went to the supermarket, saw inexpensive oranges, and bought them up. Well, the Florida and California orange growers would not be very happy about that. So they might go to Congress and say, hey, can you do something to help us out here? If Congress were to enact a tariff on imported oranges, that would mean that even though let's say the Brazilians could sell a box of oranges for $5. Now, on every box they brought into the United States, they would have to pay a $2 tax, let's say, up front. So that means that in order to sell their oranges in the American market, in order to make the same profit, they'd now have to charge $7 for a box of oranges. The $5 they originally charged, which made their profit, plus they have to cover the $2 tariff, or the tax on imports. It also means, however, that the American producers can also now sell their oranges at $7, but they're not paying a tax. That's all going to them. And so this enables the American company to be able to price their good a little higher, and it forces the importing nation to charge a higher price just to cover the cost of the tax. And then, as often happens, the tax that the government collects, let's continue the orange example, what will often happen is the government will collect that tax and then give it as a grant to the American orange growing industry to do an ad campaign on buying American oranges. So in essence, we tax goods coming into the country and then use the money to compete against the cheaper imports. What does a tariff do in the end? Well, it creates fewer imports because it's a little more expensive than it used to be, and it makes consumers spend more of their disposable income on oranges. And once again, if you're spending $7 on a box of oranges now instead of $5, that's $2 less that you're going to be able to spend somewhere else. So it helps the orange industry. It's going to hurt someone else because now you're $2 poorer if you continue to buy those oranges. The third tool that's often used is the quota. And if a tariff manipulates the price of a good by putting a tax on it, the quota manipulates the quantity of the good. So, continuing in the orange example, maybe Congress would say, instead of putting a tax on oranges, because Americans don't like to hear about taxes, we'll put a quota on the oranges instead. And what that means is, instead of allowing as many oranges come into the country as the Brazilian orange producer can sell, we say you're limited. You're limited to 3,000 tons or something like that. Now, from basic supply and demand, you should know that if we reduce the amount of supply, what are we doing? We're shifting the supply curve to the left. And that's what we'd be doing. We'd be saying you can't let all the supply in. We're shifting the supply curve to the left. If you shift the supply curve to the left, the quantity of the good purchased, the equilibrium quantity, decreases because the equilibrium price of the good increases. So once again, we've helped out the Florida and California orange industries, but we've hurt American consumers across the board who would now have to spend more in order to obtain oranges. So all of these protectionist measures have the general result of protecting very unique, targeted, specific groups. whether it be steel workers, orange growers, but it also has the effect of hurting the American consumer, who must now spend more and has less disposable income to spend on other goods. So other people get hurt and they might not even realize it. Yeah, as I harken back to the example I gave you, because I had enough disposable income, because I bought a fairly inexpensive new car engine, I still was spending money in restaurants here and art galleries and on the ship and in other places. If I had to spend all of my money on a new engine, I couldn't have spent any of that across these broad-based industries. Now, because you'll see a political economic divide here. Many interest groups seek government to install protectionist measures to help them. Most economists would say free trade is the best for everybody involved. So what has happened especially since World War II, is there have been a series of international agreements that have promoted free trade. And of course, the advent of the internet has almost made free trade a foregone conclusion. It's going to happen because anyone can go on the internet and order anything from anywhere, and it's going to happen. So, one of these organizations, one of these agreements is called the Free Trade Association. And I mentioned earlier that the United States, Canada, and Mexico are in the North American Free Trade Association, and that permits the movement of goods and services across borders without having to pay a tariff. There are other free trade associations in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia. They're fairly common. In Europe and Africa, there is a different type of arrangement, and they are called customs unions. And those are a combination of free trade across borders. But the individual members of a customs union also agree to a common policy towards outsiders. So, to give you a good example of the difference between a free trade association and a customs union, in NAFTA, Canada, US, Mexico, we allow the free movement of goods across our borders. But each country has their own policies towards all other countries. So Canada imports Cuban goods, even though the United States for many years said we will not import Cuban goods. We were allowed to have different policies. In the European Union, however, which is a customs union, that's not the case. If the majority of members of that customs union, France, Germany, all agree that they're going to embargo a product, let's say from Iran, Spain has to go along with that decision, even if they're against it. Customs unions are much tighter, much more political that way, and they use political rewards and punishment, their trade policy, as political rewards and punishment. Then overall, one of the most recent organizations that has formed is the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization basically is like the UN, except it involves trade disputes. And most of the nations in the world are part of it. They signed on, they made it a treaty, they signed on to it. And what it basically does is set up an international court. And this international court hears disputes between countries over protectionist measures. And if your nation does not have a darn good reason for a tariff or a quota or an embargo, the World Trade Organization will rule against you. And if they do, you are bound by the terms of the treaty to actually change your operations. So some people like the World Trade Organization because it cuts through the political machinations that enact tariffs and quotas. Other people dislike it for exactly that reason. They say that countries are losing sovereignty to this global entity. So that is a controversy that is going to continue throughout your generation and the ones afterwards, as nations decide to abide by this World Trade Organization treaty. I shouldn't end this video without at least mentioning the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a new free trade arrangement that the United States is seeking to enter into with Japan and South Korea and a number of Asian Pacific nations. And it's meant to form a strong trade bloc to counter China's weight. And on the one hand, there are many people who say, well, free trade is good. Free trade brings more goods and services at lower prices to consumers. On the other hand, most of us have not seen the content of the TPP agreement, and it's very large, and there's a lot of suspicion that snuck into that treaty are special perks for large corporations. Big surprise. So that, for instance, if a nation only allows copyright on intellectual material for, let's say, 10 years, that the terms of this new Trans-Pacific Partnership will extend it to 20 or 30, even though the home country's legislature or Congress hasn't enacted it. So once again, it's the giving up of some sovereignty over what goes on within a nation to a global organization. So those are the reasons for the movement towards protectionism, but there's also very, very strong global movements to fight back against protectionism, and the overall movement for the last several decades has been towards free trade, towards globalization. Will some industries die? Yes, they will. You may love blacksmiths, and you may love horseshoes, and you may love horses, but the advent of the car basically said that industry is going to die, and it has. And you may think Underwood typewriters are really cool. You know, when you do that pick and peck and you use your little, many of you have never even seen the ribbons with the white eraser goo. We use laptops. Underwood typewriter, you know, they were a great industry. Typewriters were a great industry. We don't need them. Consumers have chosen something else. Will the old industries die? Yes, they will. But that's the way of progress, and that's the way of the world. Now, just before I sign off, you may say, okay, so I've had extra money because I was able to buy a cheaper car engine, but I spent it in Canada. So how the heck does that help any American industry, right? Well, that is the topic of my third video on international trade, and that is currency exchange. And it takes a look at what happens when Americans spend money in other countries. What does that do for the value of their currency? Who does that help? Who does that hurt? This is Tom Simmons signing off and getting ready for my third sale on the Goélette Grossil. And thanks for hearing me out. Ciao.